I want everybody to be happy. I want to build consensus. I want to bring everybody along to what I see as the clear path, and I want to do it with everybody being happy and liking me. That's not the case. I know that's not the case. Admitting it's not the case and putting words to it is difficult.
Maybe you've never verbalized it quite that way, at least not out loud, but the feeling's not uncommon. As we begin Chapter 2, Gil delves into the subject by looking at the differences between leadership and management.
Now, I want to introduce these as two terms that don't necessarily mean exactly the same thing. As a matter of fact, they have very different functions in all organizations. Management is something that makes the organization operate smoothly. Management is trying to answer the question, are we doing things right? My favorite example is my first congregation, that when they sat down in a board meeting, one of the primary questions that they always love to talk about is, do we have enough candles for the Christmas Eve candlelight service? That's a management question. A management question is making sure that everything is efficient, it's neat, it's orderly, it's kind of progressing, it's doing what people expect. Management satisfies people. But leadership is quite different in every organization. Leadership is not asking the question, are we doing things right? Leadership is asking the question, are we doing right things? And once you begin to ask the question, are we doing right things, then what we know automatically is that smoothness disappears from the congregation. There is an unsettledness that goes in, and people get uncomfortable because now they have to stop and ask, what is it that we do? One of the things that I'm real clear about is that leadership requires us to learn how to make the rest of the congregation appropriately uncomfortable with itself, or else it will not change. And yet management is what we do to make everybody very satisfied. People will talk very easily about how they really are called to leadership, but they end up doing so much management. That in fact so much of our time is worried about whether there's enough candles for Christmas Eve. And what we don't talk about is what our purpose is and what we're called to do. We are so problem-oriented. How many of you came to the UU University hoping that you would get an answer to take back home? All right. You know, what I don't want you to miss is that when the resources were developed, by your own denomination, what you have here are ideas for growth, not solutions for growth. You have ideas for worship, not solutions about worship. The question isn't whether or not you can take the right answer home. The question is, can you take some resources home that will help you to raise the right question? That our task of leadership is often helping to frame the messy question that people are going to have to live with in order to be faithful, in order to be effective, in order to move ahead. And this is not easy for any of us. We spend too much time in management. Now, the fact is that every organization needs both management and leadership at the same time. There has to be some stability in order to change. There has to be some change if there's going to be any life. We have to hold the two. In a divergent environment, the balance has to shift to leadership. And yet you and I spend so much of our time worrying about people's complaints. Have you noticed that? We worry about people's complaints because they're uncomfortable, and we think that our task is to make them comfortable again. That's known as management. And so we work hard to figure out who's pleased and who's displeased, and with the displeased people, we try to satisfy them as soon as we can until we have a fully satisfied congregation. And then we are startled to realize that our congregation is so satisfied they don't want to do anything differently at all. The hardest congregation to lead is a satisfied congregation because it doesn't want to go anyplace. And yet we spend so much of our time on management. There will be more effectiveness in our congregations if, in fact, we can go home and live with a question for which people do not have easy answers. It will prompt more change and more vitality because it will create the need to have more than one idea. See, one of the things that our congregations are suffering with is a false sense of harmony. We believe that everybody in a congregation has to agree, and then we call that harmony. Wally Armbruster took a look at that, and he said, everybody singing the same note is not harmony, it's monotony. Harmony is when people sing their own individual note, and then they listen closely enough to each other to begin to blend and make something new. Make sense? And yet what we're always after is trying to make sure that we get the one idea that everybody agrees with. Friends, what you and I need in our congregations, in our board meetings, in our leadership, are multiple ideas that are willing to stand up against each other until we learn something new. Ron Heifetz is probably one of the best voices of leadership for our culture today. A lot of you already know about his work. He was a director of the Project of Leadership from Harvard School of Government. His primary book is Leadership Without Easy Answers. He draws a distinction between reactive space and balcony space. And he says most of what we do as leaders is done in reactive space. It's having to do with the stuff that's coming at you all the time. How many of you have ever made a to-do list? Have you ever made a to-do list? Oh, you've heard of those. Okay. How many of you have had the experience that you made a to-do list and about 20 minutes after you got started on your day, you might as well throw it away because of what's coming at you? Have you been there? That is reactive space. And in reactive space, you've got to deal with the stuff that's coming at you. You don't have any choices because it's urgent. It may or may not be important, but at least it's urgent. It's right there. You're demanded to have to do something about it. And that is the least thoughtful space for leaders. That what leaders have to learn how to do, Heifetz says, is get out of reactive space and get on the balcony. You need to get away from that reactive space, get on the balcony where you get the bigger picture, when you see more of what's going on. My example is always, NFL football. All the action takes place on the field. All the good information is coming from up in the stands. You got offensive and defensive coordinators watching not the individual play, but the whole field. Looking for patterns, looking for weaknesses, checking statistics because that's the history, trying to find out what the big picture is here that makes a real difference. So we've got to move away from action and into learning, and we have to stay away from neatness. How many of you were taught that neatness counts? It does. It counts against you. Right? Come on, friends, we're in a divergent time in which the answer is absolutely different for everybody that you're going to talk to, and you want to neaten that up? Can't happen. You and I need to learn how to move far enough away from management where everything is kept neat and orderly, and we have to move toward experimentation and messiness because we don't know yet how a lot of this is going to work. And this is one of the greatest challenges of leadership at all, because it means you've got to lead into areas where you don't know where it's going to go. It's amazingly difficult for people to do. I work with one congregation where they have a way of saying to each other, this is something that we really think we ought to be doing, we're really called to, is this the right thing to do? And the answer almost always is, we don't know. Why don't you try it for 6 months and then we'll talk about it? How many of you have congregations that are willing to take those kinds of risks? How many of you have congregations that you're worried to take those risks because you might lose $10? Or worse yet, 2 members. See, we're in this divergent time of change. And in a divergent time of change, there are so many metaphors now in terms of the kind of deep change that we are in culturally and institutionally. Metaphors such as we're in a time now where you have to learn how to change the tire on the bus while it's moving. Have you heard those? You have to learn how to build a bike while you're riding it. The one that I love so much is the one that I think, has been, kind of forced into congregations so much that the deep change that we're in now is like trying to build a new prison using the bricks from the old prison without losing the prisoners. Right? Now, friends, that's exactly what stops us so much, because we want everything to be so neat and controlled. We want to try something brand new in terms of our ministry as long as nobody gets upset and leaves. Do you hear that those two statements don't live together? We have to stop being so neat. We have to stop being so worried. We have to stop being so serious. I often work with congregations about the fact that they're dying from terminal seriousness. Okay? The leaders are so worried about what this congregation, and what's going to happen, that they hold on to it so tight that they won't ever try something new. We have never been invited into something as enjoyable as this moment of leadership when no one knows where the answer is. Because you're free to try anything you want. So give it a shot. There is more to that is faithful than making sure that everybody agrees and that it's nice and neat.
Now, this concept that the leader doesn't have to know the destination may make you anxious.
He said, leaders don't always have to know where they're going. Now, I kind of like to know where I'm going before I start something. And I've decided he's right, I'm going to let that go. I'm just going to jump in with both feet and just see where it goes.
And that's exactly Gil's point, that the task of a leader is not finding good answers, but finding good questions.
Going back to Heifetz for a moment, what I want you to see is how different this is from the kind of leadership that you and I have been trained in. At one point he says, imagine the difference in behavior when people operate with the idea that leadership means influencing the community to follow the leader's vision. Do you hear that? The leader is responsible for coming up with the answer. And so one form of leadership is the leader has to come up with the answer and convince everybody to move in that direction, versus a form of leadership where it means influencing the community to face into its questions. The one operates off of answers, the other operates off of questions. Friends, what I want to suggest as strongly as I can is that the leadership that you and I need to prepare ourselves for is the leadership that raises questions and makes it safe for people to talk about it. And the kinds of questions that we're talking about. Who are we? The identity question. Now, a lot of you come here having been part of your congregation for quite some time, and so the assumption is that you know who you are. How many of you think of yourself as younger than you actually are? All right? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Up here, we're asking the question, how many of you think of yourself as thinner than you actually are? But that's a different workshop, so we're not going to go there. It is easier for us to think about the way we were than it is to think about the way we are. Now, we're going to come back to that tonight when we're talking about leadership again, because this is really important. But for the most part, we are in congregations that are really clear about where they came from and who they were, but they are not nearly as honest about who they are right now. Can you raise questions of identity in your congregation and wrestle with who you actually are right now? What has God called us to do? Fundamental leadership question. Once we ask the question, what has God called us to do, we're asking a purpose question. What is the purpose of this congregation? Not the purpose of all congregations. What's the purpose of this congregation? What are we trying to do? What is it that we are contributing? What difference do we hold ourselves responsible for making? For the most part, friends, I work with too many congregations that are very, very steady in strategy and have forgotten about purpose. We are so wed to the way we do things, we forgot why. A favorite example, I was working with a congregation in Canada. It was an Anglican church. They were very proud of their history. They were the daughter church of a very well-known cathedral in England. Very proud of that history. And so when I was talking to the priest, one of the things he was saying is, Gil, you have to understand how frustrated I am, because one of the things that I cannot change in this congregation is the musical setting for Christmas Eve. He said, it is the most miserable musical setting I have ever seen for liturgy. And I have been trying for 9 years now to change it, but I can't, because this is the musical setting that we got from our mother church in England. I finally called the church in England, and I asked for the music director, and I said, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with this miserable music? And the person thought for me and said, well, wait a minute. Oh, that's so terrible. We stopped using that 35 years ago. Do you hear it? That too many of our congregations are wed to the strategy and have forgotten about the purpose. What is the purpose of your congregation? What difference is it supposed to be making? This is one of the hardest questions, because if you don't know what difference your congregation is supposed to be making, you have no idea how to go about it. If you have no idea what difference your congregation is supposed to be making, it's very hard to think about doing anything except what you've already done. And then the third of the formation questions is, who is our neighbor? The context question. The ability to know that not only have you changed as a congregation, but the world around you has changed, and because of that, you in fact have to rethink the way that you are going to be in ministry as a community of faith. The kicker is that people are always asking us for leadership. We want you, as our leaders, as our elected leaders, as our called clergy, we want you to help us to find the right way into our future and to be vital and effective. We would like you to help us to deal with this divergent culture that has changed from a convergent time. We want you to help us to figure out what we need to do, but we're only willing to reward management. I worked with a congregation one time that risked themselves deeply. I mean, really deeply. It was a very small congregation. It was in an area that was continuing to have, kind of population growth around them. They had never had a full-time pastor. They had never had any settled clergy leadership in all of their history, and they decided that if they were really going to be vital, they had to move to full-time ministry. They had to have a parsonage for the first time. They had to change the way in which they were providing for leadership, and so they did. They put together all the resources they had, which really was a considerable task for this small congregation. And not only did they call a new full-time clergy, but they actually built the parsonage. And when I talk about built the parsonage, I'm talking built. They built it with their hands. They dug the foundation out. They poured the concrete. They put up the cinder block. They put the framing up. They built the parsonage. And they called their new pastor. And they said to their new pastor, we want you to help us to respond to all this growth that is happening around us and to kind of keep ourselves open to these new people who are so different from us. And she did. And she did really a good job. And she involved a number of them in that. So she was asked for leadership, and she performed it. I got the telephone call to come work with them because there had been anonymous threats left on her answering machine from people who were going to blow up the very parsonage that they had just built. And when I went and worked with them, what I discovered was that, they were actually quite pleased to have these new people in their congregation, as long as none of them were elected to the board. As long as none of them had a voice at a committee meeting. As long as nothing in their comfort range changed. Now that's a pretty serious kind of measure of reward, or what I sometimes call negative rewards. Here's your new parsonage. As long as you do what we like, you can have it, otherwise we'll blow it up. But that's only the extreme of what we face every single day as leaders. Our clergy do, day after day, and so do key lay people. We want you to make our church effective unless it makes us uncomfortable, and then we might break relationship with you. We might not talk to you as freely. We might not include you in some of our conversations. Don't miss, friends, that what we're talking about here is difficult to do.